Well, welcome everyone. Very happy today to introduce Selcuk Atli. I remember Selcuk as a student here. He was an entrepreneur while he was at Rensselaer, and immediately went into a series of startups that have, each proved to be successful with SocialWire and Boostable and a nonprofit group, Nomadic Ventures. His most recent one is in the gaming industry with Bunch. Hopefully you got a chance to check it out. Kelly and I were on it earlier. There we go. I just had to show this score. 47-4 in the basketball, as well as the quiz score. Didn't go her way anyway, but lots of fun with your friends to chat with them and be able to play games as well. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Selcuk. Thank you.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me. It's good to see you guys. What I wanted to do was give you a quick overview of my adventures to date and basically go from there, like open up the questions. I could kind of talk about like building startups and kind of pivoting your startups and coming up with ideas and all that goodness. So I was at RPI back in 2009. After that, I basically created these 4 companies, one of which was a nonprofit, all of which exited. Right now, I'm currently working on this video chat application called Bunch. So quick story on my end is I'm Turkish. I grew up in Turkey. I went to Koç University for computer science real quick. And then after I was valedictorian, I got a Fulbright scholarship and went to RPI, did a master's in information technology over there. And then after Fulbright, they basically kind of kick you out of the country and they're like, go back to your home country and teach the American ways to Turkish folk. And I was like, can I blog about it and post on Twitter and stuff? They said, no, go back. And I said, fine. So I did go back and started a company called Iletken, which was basically this like recommendation engine systems. And I like to consider this company the company that I made most of my mistakes on, so I could kind of learn a lot faster. One of the kind of things, so what it was is basically we helped build personalization systems for folks. So like, when you go to Amazon, they say like people who bought this also bought this. Or when you go to Pandora or Spotify, that kind of gives like a personalized radio station. So one of the challenges of that is like, we didn't establish who our customer and market was. We're like, this technology is really cool. Let's basically build this technology for every application. And then we're trying to focus on e-commerce companies and telecommunication companies and news websites. And also the team wasn't technical enough. Like there was just one deep engineer and like it wasn't really balanced. But then I was like, hey, this whole recommendation engine thing is kind of like very 2000s. Because there's a lot of companies that does this stuff. Let's focus on social personalization for e-commerce companies. We were basically saying back in 2011, if you log into a website using Facebook Connect, can I learn a lot about you using your Facebook data to personalize your experience instantly without having to click a bunch of products or buy a bunch of stuff to understand what you're looking for? We then pivoted that company to not recommendations, but advertising those recommendations. So essentially, we would work with really big online retailers like Zappos, and we would help them advertise all their products automatically on Facebook in the form of product recommendations. So it just like solved a different problem for the same customers. And as a response to that, Facebook gave us an innovation award in 2013. We're like, this is one of the coolest products on our platform. That's lets you buy advertising. It was good because we sold the company to Rakuten, which is like the Amazon of Japan. So then while I was building that company, I came up with another idea, which became my next company, Boostable. Again, in the advertising technology space, the picture that you see here is my co-founder and Paul Graham, which is the founder of Y Combinator. if you know Y Combinator, is basically the incubator that launched like Dropbox and Airbnb and things like that. He retired after this class, so we were just like really lucky to have to be able to work with Program before he retired. And what we did with that company is we helped sellers on online marketplaces push a button and buy ads on Facebook. So the problem that I saw while I was building my previous company was we would somewhat easily be able to sell advertising to retailers like Zappos, but it was so hard selling advertising to online marketplaces like eBay or Ticketmaster or Eventbrite or Etsy, because if you buy something on Etsy, like $100 worth of products, Etsy makes $2 while the seller makes $98, right? But even though Etsy has all the data in the world to buy advertising and measure that advertising, they can't really buy it because they just don't make enough money to invest in the advertising. On the other hand, the seller makes a lot of money, but they have no idea how to advertise. They don't have the data to advertise. And even if they did, they couldn't measure the results because it's not their website. So we basically did this thing where we integrated with the marketplaces to give a one-click advertising solution to their seller base, which incentivized the marketplaces to promote our product, because if their sellers bought advertising, it was free advertising dollars for the marketplace. So when you think about it, it's like PayPal, but for advertising. So we sold that company to Metric Collective back in 2016, which is like an advertising roll-up here in New York. And then I joined 500 Startups, which is a VC firm. So I like to say I joined the dark side of the force and became an investor for a couple of years. So invested in a bunch of companies and stuff. Then I got bored of being an investor because I like building stuff more. So I started this thing called 500 Labs, which is what people call a startup studio. I think the name comes from movie studios, where just like a movie studio can produce multiple movies and kind of launch them. A startup studio can essentially run experiments for new startup ideas and turn them into companies. So that was my founding partner at 500 Labs. It's basically like an initiative that we did with 500 startups. It's like a fund where we invested in our own ideas, essentially. While I was doing that, I also started a nonprofit organization called Nomadic Mentors. It's like Doctors Without Borders for entrepreneurs, like Jason very succinctly put. We connected entrepreneurs and successful founders who were willing to travel and mentor entrepreneurs around the world with the host organizations that would invite them. So we had folks like the CEO of Y Combinator and Ariel Zuckerberg and Cyan Bannister and stuff. It's like probably one of the most prominent mentor networks in the Valley that got acquired by the family. It's not the mafia, it's a startup accelerator called the family. And then one of the things I heard when I was building the startup studio 500 Labs from a lot of my VC friends is that most startup studios just become one of the companies that they're most excited about, which exactly happened in our case, because we had this idea for a bunch and we kind of built it and we tried it ourselves and we're like, this is so cool. Like, why don't we have this? Like, let's just stop experimenting and just focus on this company, which is what we did. So we raised about $28 million from investors like General Catalyst, London Venture Partners, Betaworks and stuff, but also almost every large game developer that makes multiplayer games in the world. And this is Bunch. It lets you video chat and you just push a button to play your favorite games with your friends. So it comes with built-in multiplayer games, as you can see here. So this is a trivia game I think that you guys played earlier. But there's a lot of really cool games called like Mars Dash, which is like Mario Kart with your friends where you get to freeze them and fly over them. You can play games like Draw Party, where it's like Pictionary with video chat. And you can also play your favorite games on the App Store, like Among Us and Roblox and Fortnite. So we're funded by and work with developers like Electronic Arts, Supercell, Ubisoft, Riot Games, Miniclip, Tencent, and stuff. These little game studios. And people like the app. They're like, this is Bunch is a miracle and stuff, which is kind of fun to read these things. It's a lot more fun than building advertising technology products, I can tell you that. We've been featured around, like Forbes wrote about us recently in our recent Series A article, and Fortune called us one of the 5 apps that are popular with Gen Z. And then I also am a singer-songwriter. You can listen to my band on Spotify and Apple Music and stuff. It's called the Hms, because it's really difficult to yell it out in a concert. It's kind of by design. Like you can't say like, bring out the Hms. It's kind of hard to say. So that's like a quick overview. some of that stuff.
Well, we could start off with a question, Katrina.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. That was really interesting to hear. Thank you for that. So, my question is that you it seems like the companies that you founded and been part of, you've pivoted a lot in terms of what like sector within technology. So, you with
Right.
Bunch, you have gaming, and then you were working with ads and stuff like that.
Right.
How do you solve problems and continue to be innovative when you've kind of like
Right.
put stepped foot into so many different markets within technology?
I do think it's actually helpful to not have a lot of context on what you're working on, because like I think one of the things about startups is that it helps to be naive sometimes, because if you're like really experienced in an area, you're like, that's not possible, and everybody else thinks that's not possible, so you're just not going to basically look at problems in a different way, right? And that was even the same thing with like advertising technology, because before I built an advertising technology company that won an innovation award from Facebook, I hadn't run $100 worth of advertising campaign in my life, right? My background was in personalization technology, but like that basically gave us an insight. We're like, hey, why can't advertising be as automated and personalized as product recommendations? Was a question that we thought to ask, right? Because if I was running an advertising agency, I'd be like, well, this is how ads are run. And the same thing as gaming, right? So like when we started working on the idea for Bunch, like a lot of like top executives in the gaming industry, and I was fortunate enough to be able to get coffee meetings with these like top executives in the gaming industry, even though I was like a newbie in the gaming industry. Like a lot of people thought that what we were working was stupid, because they're like, well, people don't play real-time multiplayer games on their phone. Like, why the hell do they need you, or stuff, right? But then we kind of figured out, we're like, look, your phone is as smart as your computer 3 years ago. And there's these real-time multiplayer games. Maybe they're not as popular, but they're coming, right? We didn't have Among Us, we didn't have Fortnite, we didn't have PUBG when we started the company, but we knew that was happening from afar. And we also knew that like playing LAN parties with our friends in the same room, or like playing video games is a lot of fun. And we're like, why shouldn't this work on your phone? Didn't sound crazy to us because we were not that immersed in that space. I think being an outsider gives you that kind of fresh perspective that you're able to ask these questions.
Well, one of my own questions here. You had two initial startups that I think had a very structured, clear business model. Could you take us through the business model of Bunch and how, does it work with advertising, or is it just about building the network as large as you can and then you get acquired by X company and so forth?
I mean, there's two potential. Like we're basically not really prior. Like we're lucky enough to have raised a lot of venture capital, right? So we're not really too worried about monetizing, and that's by design, because essentially this is a network effects business, right? So like the company that's going to win is going to get to network effects as faster than others, and like even if we made money on a small scale, that doesn't matter. Like somebody could take us over, right? So that's our current thinking, but also it's monetizable in the sense that one, we're creating a place where people come to play their favorite games and discover those games, and people already discover and download a lot of games through Bunch, right? So you can basically build a native advertising model, which is, I guess, I can't get away from advertising because I end up building an advertising system on this here thing as well. So you can essentially create a model where game developers are paying to distribute their content, live ops updates and games to players more aggressively through a promotional system. And also we know that our player base, which is mostly like Gen Z kids, like the 12 to 18-year-olds, are willing to kind of pay for customization and skins and things like that. So we're basically building a lot more ways to have a more expressive environment before doing and after parties. And we're lucky that like Twitch and Discord kind of proven that business model, so we can just copy theirs. Yeah. But like we're not prioritizing right now. We're just trying to grow as fast as we can.
So my question's related to the nonprofit space. So I've been actually kind of curious about traditional business as a nonprofit. So I just want to know if there are any suggestions or recommendations you have for those like starting stages of that process, because I know it's maybe a little different than like Bunch.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I'm not gonna pretend that I know a lot about nonprofits. We just started a nonprofit because we wanted that idea that we had to exist, and we figured out some of the things along the way. But it's a little different. Yeah, it's basically we didn't have to worry about a business model or anything like that, and like we didn't need to be very aggressive about it. But it's a whole different thing, right? Because one of the challenges that we had was like, well, we don't want to basically kind of charge for speakers because we think that kind of doesn't align with our model, but it kind of made it more difficult for us to scale the business. At the end, like that's kind of one of the reasons why we couldn't build like an executive team for it and just like launch it, but ended up kind of selling it to, which is like giving it to an accelerator that could kind of expand on that. I think like one of the things that I learned from that experience is if a business that you're starting can be a for-profit business, I think it should be a for-profit business. Like if what you're building doesn't make sense to be a for-profit business, then it makes sense. Then it's okay to make it a nonprofit. Like in hindsight, maybe it could have made more sense to make it a for-profit business.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about how Bunch is funded by top game developers like EA. So how did you go about, I guess, forming that relationship, and what is that relationship like? Like, do they have equity in Bunch, or what is that relationship like?
Well, they do have equity in Bunch because they've invested in our last financing round. And I think I'll talk about like why we pursued that model and why it worked. And I'll talk a little about how we made that happen. What we're really building at Bunch is this cross-game and ultimately cross-platform social network for games, right? Because like games can have chat systems and stuff like that, but what players want is like one social graph where they can play all their favorite games with the same people really easily, right? And where they can move, like maybe you want to play some Fortnite and then you want to play some Among Us and you want to kind of cool it off with some Roblox, right? So it needs to work across games. And game developers know that even if this is something they can build, it's difficult to create a network like this as a game developer yourself and invite other game developers to work with you. Right? So if EA goes like, hey guys, here's a social network for games, like, hey Ubisoft, why don't you join? And they're going to be like, why would I join that? I made my own here. Right? So it's basically important to be able to have like some kind of Switzerland in the middle. But then the question is going to be like, hey, okay, fine, I can't build this myself, but like, why would I send you millions of users and turn you into a platform is a question that a game developer can ask us. And that's kind of an irrelevant question once we get to a very large scale, because we can send them users too. But one way to solve that chicken and egg problem is to basically let those developers invest in the company where they have an upside in our success as well. And it basically works for us because we get to build a platform a lot faster and it gives us an unfair advantage in our market, right? So it basically makes it more difficult for others to compete with us, for those developers.
Hey, I just wanted to ask, I've heard a few stories of people going from being founders to joining venture capital, but you went from founder to venture capital and then back again. I just wanted to ask what kind of perspective you gained, as an investor, and, I guess what prompted you to say that you wanted to go back to, being a builder and an entrepreneur.
Right. I think there's a few, like, I thought about this a lot too. And like, I have a lot of my friends who just move into venture capital and stuff like that after being founders. I think one of the things about being a VC is it's basically like you grab a coffee and meet with a founder and you're like, hey, and it's fun. You get to play startup, right? Without any other responsibility. Like, you're like, hey, here's how we can solve all these problems. You're like, here's somebody that you should know or whatever. And then now I go like, no, now run towards the bullets. Well, I'm going to go pick up a coffee and go to my next meeting, right? So I don't really, and especially if you're a VC, it's not your money, right? I think it might be a little different for being an angel investor where you're just like spending your own money doing it. So that's like one thing. Another thing about, I think, VC is, and that might be good for some people, because like you context switch a lot, you get to talk to a lot of really smart people, you learn a lot about industries and stuff like that, which are things I like. One thing I don't like about it is basically, as an operator, as a founder, you do things and then you get feedback quite fast, right? Like I decide to ship a product feature and like I know it works or not. I ship a product or I do a partnership or I'll hire someone, and the feedback loop is really tight. You do something, you know it's working or not. It's almost like a heat-seeking missile. You basically keep iterating to kind of find the right thing. As an investor, you don't know if you're good or not, at least for like 5-10 years. It's a startup is not gonna, because you're not really investing in companies to get like a moderate outcome. You're basically trying to find the big winners, and like the things that you invested in are not going to become big winners in like 3 months, right? You have to wait them out. And like I realize I don't like that kind of long feedback cycle. And I also like the responsibility, right? So when I come up with a problem, I like to work with people to solve that problem, or just basically find people that are going to like. So I like having the responsibility and accountability, which is why. But also I like working on a lot of different ideas, which is like one of the reasons why I started a startup studio. I was like, hey, can I basically be an operator and work on all these ideas at the same time? Was something I was trying to do, but then realized it's actually not very efficient, and because it's hard to build companies unless you're really focused 100% on them. So then got back to just building one company at a time.
Hi. So I've noticed that you been quite a few companies over the past decade and developed in different fields. I just wanted to ask, do you plan on continuing to like be a serial entrepreneur, or do you think that running Bunch is going to be a long-term thing that you'll be heavily involved with for like a long period of time?
As a founder, experience and team and stuff like that matters a lot in kind of making companies successful. But I think Bunch has been the company that I've been most lucky with, both in terms of like team, but most importantly, timing and space, right? So we basically built this thing that made a lot of sense like 3 years before people realized it would make a lot of sense. Because I think, like one of the things that Bill Gross, the founder of Idea Lab, which is actually the original startup studio, said after starting all these companies is the thing that makes companies, the factor that has the most impact of success of a startup beyond team, idea, amount of funding is timing. Right. So I think we got it really right on like Bunch. But again, I'm not sure if that's like something that we could control that a lot. Like you need to rely on your intuition or whatever. But so I feel we're really lucky with Bunch. And I think we have a unique mission, an opportunity to create a company that can become an internet treasure, like something that a lot of people know and use, like Facebook and Twitch and like other things. So that is quite exciting to me. But like, I don't see myself running a company for like 20 years. I probably, as long as it continues to have a very high impact and I continue to have a lot of fun doing it, I'll do it.
Yeah, so like I had a question, like what really like influenced you to like come up with Bunch, like the party app?
Sure, it's actually experiences. Like I think one of the things that you want to do is, I think experiencing different things is really important to being a founder, because like what are the things that you experience that can help you connect dots that are not like obvious to other people? And you don't do that through reading books and blogs or whatever, right? So you do that through experience. And one of the things that I did growing up is like when I was 12 years old, I co-founded the first online game magazine in Turkey. So Jason, I don't know if you probably know this, but like, so we had this game magazine that had like a dozen people writing for it, and they didn't know that the editors were two 12-year-olds. Because on the internet, apparently your boss could be two 12-year-old kids and you'd have no idea. And a lot of what we did is get together with our friends and do LAN parties, right? So bring our PCs to each other or go to like an internet cafe. And a lot of the fun part of playing games like that is to play them with people that you know and like literally yell at each other while you're playing, or like see someone's reactions like while you're shooting at them. And we figured like, hey, why can't you do that on your phone? And I was also kind of thinking a lot about messaging. Like what's the next phase of messaging, right? So you can send a gift to your friends, you can send a Spotify song to your friends, but like, why is it so hard to just invite them to a game to play together? And why does every game have to do it differently? Like, why isn't there like a global interface for playing games together? And those were like some of the kind of high level abstract thinking that we had, which resulted in a prototype that we put together in like a month. And we're like, this is a lot of fun. And the thing that made me really want to kind of double down on it, I remember this, because at the time I was still living in San Francisco. Now I live in New York and our company's based in New York. One of the things that we do in the Bay Area is we go to each other's house parties and like show the apps that we're building to our friends. And in one such party, I showed like an early prototype of Bunch. And in 2 minutes, like 8 people started playing together in the same room, and they were having so much fun. And everybody else at the party thought it was like a cult, because everybody was looking at their phones and laughing together, and nobody had an idea like what they were doing. I was like, this is really cool. If you really reduce the friction to play and make it a lot more fun, like something magical happens. And like, why can't we basically enable this for like hundreds of millions of people? That's kind of how we decided to focus on the company.
Could you speak a little bit about your experience in Y Combinator? Like, what were the most important things you learned, and I guess would you recommend it overall?
I think it's probably more useful. I think it can be more helpful to an entrepreneur that was less experienced than me at the time, right? Because I think it's especially a lot more helpful if you really don't know anyone in the valley or whatever, and you kind of get connected. It gives you like a stamp of approval in a way. That helped us. Like that probably helped us raise more money faster. But like we could have like done it ourselves because I basically previously started a company already, raised like $5 million, and a lot of like the really good investors and stuff like that. So in my case, it was not that area wasn't that impactful in my case, but it was still helpful. Like for example, when I was negotiating the deal with Paul Graham, I was like, hey, I'll take the deal if you introduce us to the Airbnb founders because we wanted to kind of work with them to build like an advertising system. And he said like, sure. And then like next month I had a meeting with Nate, one of the co-founders of Airbnb, where like they got a deal done. Right. So that was basically helpful. Like I don't think Nate would have taken a meeting with me unless we did YC, right? I've learned a lot more about the importance of clear and concise communication from that too, like especially like working with program and stuff like less marketing talk, more like kind of concrete, like things when you're communicating what you're doing to customers and investors and stuff like that. So that was helpful. And I think the community is good. So like there's a lot of really high quality startups in the batch. I'm not sure what it is right now. There was like a couple of companies that became billion-dollar companies in our batch. Like for example, there's Cruise and stuff like that. So a good stamp of approval. And if you can get a lot out of it, you can get a lot of it. It really depends on what you need and what you can get out of it.
Selcuk, I think I read that your user base has grown 50x since spring. So were you prepared for the uptick since I think I would relate it to the start of COVID?
Like my co-founder and our CTO had a lot of situations where we were crying together at the time. No, not at all. So the way it kind of happened was kind of interesting too. So it's basically on, I think like the 12th of March, all of a sudden in like a single day, like so many users started coming to the application. And we were like, what is happening and who are these users? And when we looked at the database, we saw that like the analytics, we saw that they were all coming from Italy. And we were like, hey, thanks for using the app, but like, why are you using it? And they were like, well, we're in lockdown and we don't have anything to do. And like, this is awesome to get kind of stay in touch with our friends and play games. I'm like, oh, okay. So this is happening because of the lockdowns. It's like something that we realized after the fact, because we were like, who are these people and why are they using our application? And then like that pattern started continuing in like Spain and Latin America and like all these other countries. And like, we just became like a global app in like 2 weeks. That was kind of crazy. But again, when you're building an application and search for product market fit, you oftentimes want to prioritize the ability to ship features and ship things faster than making sure that everything is very stable. What means is like when you really need to scale, sometimes you're caught off guard. And in that situation, we kind of got caught off guard. So like our servers would kind of start failing and stuff like that. But the team worked really hard, basically rewriting a lot of our backend and like scaling our servers and stuff like that. So now we can basically can scale like 10x higher than where we are. But we're probably kind of get to those points again. It's always this balance between like, how are you going to ready to kind of scale 10x, but then how do you build things that people want in the meantime? So
yeah. So can you talk about the difference in terms of the IT or CS programming in Europe or here in the US? And what about now that you're in Silicon Valley? What about the tech entrepreneurial environment in Europe? And I'm asking because I'm an international student and I always trying to navigate my visa, and it's really complicated in the US, the immigration system.
Right. What I find in general, and this is basically like US and Europe, but also even like Silicon Valley versus most places else, there is a lot more people that are building things. So like one of the things that I used to say is like when I'm just walking down University Avenue in Palo Alto, if I just basically bump into someone, they'll probably have something useful to say about my startup. Right. It's basically helpful to be in a community where there's a lot of other people that are building interesting things, combined with a lot of other investors that would fund those things, right? Because a lot of times you'll basically find that investors in Silicon Valley, and even more so than New York, like we're based in New York City. I've spent the last 10 years in the Valley, but most of our investors are still like Silicon Valley based, right? So but you'll find that a lot of those investors will have more gusto in like investing and stuff. So, like they basically are less short-term focused in their investments, and they can kind of take bets. That's why you'll see a lot of times if you like talk to like an investor in upstate New York or New York City or whatever, they will not have that level of boldness in their investments, which attracts entrepreneurs. And at the same time, a lot of companies that would buy your company are based in Silicon Valley as well. So, and it's okay to be elsewhere, right? So you can have a company in New York City that Google buys, right? Because they have engineers over there too. I think some of that is changing though, because especially on the investor side, it was helpful. I think personally it was helpful to be in San Francisco for like 9 years, because I built a lot of relationships with investors who now I work with. Like for example, Nico Bonazzos from General Catalyst, who led our most recent Series A. I've known him for like 6 years, right? It's basically important to build relationships with these people that you're going to be working together for the long term. But I think, especially with COVID-19, some of that is changing, right? Because if you're an investor that goes like, I'm not going to invest in your company before I grab a coffee with you and talk to you in person, then you're just not going to invest in companies, right? You can't do that even if the startup is based in San Francisco. So I think some of that is changing. So where you are ultimately is going to matter less, even though it matters. And what I find in Europe is kind of the same. So investors are more conservative in their investment decisions, and entrepreneurs are basically more risk averse, I find. But like still, there's a lot of really great companies that come out of many other places too, right? So I think there's exceptions to the rule, and we're going to see more and more exceptions given that we're moving into a more remote first world in terms of like work culture and investment. There's benefits to not being in Silicon Valley too, right? So like I wouldn't hire engineers in San Francisco, for example, and most of our development team is actually in Toronto, because it's like super expensive and super hard to build high quality technical teams in San Francisco, because it's so competitive that like they're like, oh, should I get like a crazy rich salary from Uber and Google or work for your startup? I just censored myself. It's easier to be in an environment where there's a lot of really smart people and you don't really need to compete with the giants. And I think as RPI students, I think you have an advantage being in Troy too, right? So for example, there's like really smart students over there that you can hire, and like they're probably not being poached left and right by Google and Facebook, right?
Well, we have a few more minutes. I'd love to hear a little bit about the model of startup success and finding other ideas that you mentioned about earlier in your talk.
Mm-hmm. Sure, let me do that 1 sec. So this is a model that I put while I was an investor at 5 other startups, and it got picked up by like VentureBeat and stuff like that. And I found it helpful when I was following entrepreneurs. So the model is called pivot pyramid. So basically kind of like, how do you pivot your idea? Because a lot of times the idea that you start with is not going to be the idea that you find success with, right? I think a lot of the skills is basically like, how do you mold and shape your idea to find product market fit? And that usually occurs out of a series of pivots, like some small, some larger. And I've pivoted a bunch of times in my startups too. Like what I did with, for example, SocialWire, which was called also Manifest Commerce, is we started with a recommendation engine that would show recommendations based on your Facebook information on the e-commerce site, to something that advertised those products on Facebook instead of showing them on your sites, right? So it was a completely different problem for a similar customer using a similar technology, right? So what you want to do as a startup is like search for product market fit. And one of the things that people ask is like, what is product market fit? Like people say like, if you have to ask, you don't really have product market fit, right? So what that means is like your product is working so well for the customer base you're targeting that you don't have to worry about finding customers. They just come to you, and like the problem that you really have is like, how do I keep my servers up, or how do I hire enough salespeople and stuff? And it kind of feels magic. Like it's basically like, how does it work? I haven't talked about this presentation in a long time, so I'm kind of like, what is the next slide? So ultimately, the way you get the product market fit is like doing a whole bunch of small experiments. Like it's not like one big pivot. It's not like you had like a dream one night, you wake up, basically knock the nightstand over and you're like, I have the idea. That's not really how it works. You basically make a tons of small changes, and like one of those things work usually. How many of you have heard like the term growth hacking? Like it's talked a lot about startups and stuff like that. So growth hacking is actually like a very minimal version of this. right? So growth hacking means like, let's try a bunch of little experiments and changing things. Let's have a hypothesis about like this idea, like, hey, if we did this, we're going to get a lot more users. You do it, you measure it, see if it works. If it's working, you spend more time on it, you scale it, right? So the whole thing about growth hacking is how can I come up with these little experiments that can potentially lead to growth? And assuming some of these are going to be successful, some are going to be failure. But when you think about a startup, the growth experiments that you can do are like tip of the iceberg. Ultimately, you need to constantly be experimenting with every aspect of your startup or your thesis to make sure that you have a thesis that maps perfectly to what the market needs. And a lot of times, unless you're Steve Jobs, you're probably not going to come up with it right away. One of the things that we put together at the time is this thing called pivot pyramid, by realizing that you're going to need to make changes across all these series of assumptions about your product, right? So what are some of your assumptions as a company? Because one of the things that Dave Muckler said, which is the founder of Fire and Startups, is a startup that is confused about who their customers are and how they're going to make money. So ultimately, you have an assumption on a bunch of those things, and you're hoping that your assumptions come true. So what are your assumptions about? They're about who's my customer? What is the problem I'm solving for that customer? What is the product I'm going to build to solve that problem for that customer? What kind of technology can I use to build that product that I'm talking about? And once I have all the stuff, how can I get customers? How can I get users? And ultimately, like a startup is like an ever-changing business plan across all these assumptions. And there's basically companies that pivoted in a lot of these areas. Like, for example, Shopify actually pivoted who their customers were when they started. When Shopify started, they were actually selling snowboards online. And they were like, well, nobody wants our snowboards, but a lot of people like the e-commerce software that we built. So let's just basically sell our e-commerce software to people who need it. And they completely shifted who their customers were. Another type of pivot is like changing what your problem is. And this is I'll give you a company example of a Criteo, which is very similar to my company, where they started by building a recommendation engine for like online like websites. And they were like, you know what, instead of recommending this product, let's start advertising them. So they basically, let's still help e-commerce websites, but let's not solve the personalization problem for them. Let's solve the advertising problem for them of bringing their customers back. Another one, like solution is like Meerkats. Like they basically were helping people get together with their friends when they're physically apart. And Meerkats' solution for that was like, let's have people go live when they're together. And they changed their product such that they would basically start a live stream on Twitter, which was like a change in the product that gave them product market fit at the time. And Facebook was an example of technology pivot, right? So for example, I don't know if you guys remember, but Facebook's initial foray into mobile was through HTML5. They were like, who needs mobile apps? We'll basically build like an HTML5 version of like Facebook on mobile and everybody's going to use it. Nobody gave a fuck, right? Sorry for bleeping myself here, but for the users, you don't really care that if Facebook is built with C++ or PHP, you care about the product, but it can actually help kind of make your product work. And ultimately, it's like the last layer is growth. What are the things that you're basically changing, right? So growth pivot could be changing your pricing or introducing a new customer channel. Like for Airbnb, it was like when people post listing on Airbnb, they would automatically post it on Craigslist, right? That's not like a product feature, that's like a growth hack that leads to growth. What are some of the key takeaways from this model? And I'm gonna wrap up real quickly. So if you're looking at this as a building or a pyramid from bottom to top, you wanna experiment with things at the bottom less frequently, right? You can't change who your customer is every minute because otherwise you just get nauseous from building your startup. But then changing like the way that you get customers or changing your technology is a lot easier than changing a lot of these fundamental assumptions. Another one is changing something at the bottom leads to changes at the top, right? So for example, if you change who your customers are, you probably need to change the problem you're solving, right? But you can basically still solve a different problem for the same customer, right? Or you can change your technology without changing your product. But if you change your product, you probably need to change your technology. Another thing that I basically see a lot of times, it's a mistake with startups that were pitching me when I was an investor or like companies that I talked to is, and this is a mistake that I've done in my first company is not starting with the customers, but starting with product and technology, right? If you're building a building, you don't start building the roof, right? You start building the base. And the base of every startup is who is your customer and what problem are you solving for them? So you want to always like start at the bottom. And technology, you'll just basically trash it and rebuild it a bunch of times. It doesn't matter because people get too stuck on technology. Like we're in the middle of changing our technology stack right now, right? Nobody cares, but like assume you're going to throw your technology. And another one that's important is if you choose like a very large customer base, like that is like a very different, like not a very focused customer base, or like even worse, if you choose to focus on different types of customers at the same time, since everything that you're doing depends on your customer assumption, right? All your assumptions are on your problem and your product and everything depends on who your customer is. You'll have to come up with different assumptions for each of those customers, right? So basically, you're building multiple pyramids at the same time. And like, what are you thinking, right? Because you're a startup, you're like two people and a dog, you're not going to build multiple pyramids, right? That's why it's important to start with a very refined customer segment that can get larger over time. Because a lot of really successful startups start by solving a really important problem for a niche customer base. It's a lot easier to grow your startup that way than basically, I'm going to build something that solves all the problems for everyone in the world. Like, it's really difficult, and you're not going to compete doing that against Google or Facebook. This is something I mentioned. Assume you're going to dump your technology because it's here. Like, nobody cares. Like, ultimately, your users don't even see what technology you're using. And a lot of really successful startups have shitty technology, or they basically redo their technology multiple times. All experiments must target growth in some way. So it's important to be methodical and scientific about a lot of your assumptions. But that's the model.
Very, very interesting. I think that aligns with a lot of the things of the business model canvas that we use to teach entrepreneurship RPI, and but it gives a nuanced additional layer that really focuses on the customer that I think the business model canvas doesn't.
Yeah, and I think the business model canvas is like too static, right? I think it's like business model canvas is built for like MBAs who want to manage supply chains and stuff. Like what I realize in startups, like every assumption you have will change at all times. So you're basically almost dealing with a multi-dimensional Rubik's Cube or chess or something. So I think the right way to approach a startup is not to have like the static business plan that you write once and put it on your shelf. Is to basically kind of continuously reevaluate your assumptions on every layer of your company.
So we have a question we've been trying to ask all the speakers of this series. If you were a freshman at Rensselaer today, what do you think you would be working on, or what would motivate you to potentially consider as an entrepreneur?
I think I would try to find the people that I'd want to build things with, because I think like a lot of times like team is a lot more important than ideas. And most startups fail because of like founder conflict or like team issues. So I would look at the time that I'm spending to identify really smart people to do stuff with. I think that's important because like you don't want to basically meet your co-founders at like a startup dating thing. You want to basically have spent time with them, gone through issues and challenges. So that's, I think, one thing. And the other one is like just follow your curiosity, right? Basically find stuff that you're excited about and spend a lot of time in those spaces. And also don't commit to a company or a project before you know it's working, right? Because one of the kind of, I think, awesome things about being in college is like you have optionality, right? So just work on cool stuff with no expectation, and like hopefully some of that stuff turns into interesting things. And then that way you don't basically overcommit to an idea that's not going to work.
Hi. Thank you for your time. Really enjoyed the talk. I have like one short kind of funny question, but have you ever seen the movie The Social Network? Because your story really reminds me of that a lot. And it's one of my favorite movies. So I was just wondering.
Yeah, I've seen it. And like the funny thing is with this company Bunch, when I started the company, I was still living in San Francisco. And my co-founders, Jason and Jordan, were living in Toronto, and like we're just kind of working kind of different time zones and stuff. And we got funding from BetaWorks, which is like an incubator in New York. And I was like, you know what? Let's just rent an apartment in Chelsea on the East Coast and live together and live and code for like 4 months.
Yes.
We did rent like an apartment with like 5-6 dudes. We were just like living and coding at the same time. And after the fact, I realized it was like very similar. It's not very sustainable.
The part about your talk about going to house parties and showing apps and people were addicted to it, it reminded me of that. But the real question I have is, you know, what I have seen in the startup world in the past, 40 years since the 80s, I guess, is that there's kind of two crops. There's software startups and there's more hard tech startups. And I kind of work more in the world of hard tech startups. And I'm interested to your opinion and your ideas on how what do you think the differences are in the journey of entrepreneurship of a software versus a hard tech startup?
It's probably the feedback cycle is a lot longer, right? Because with most startups, if you can't launch something that's marginally useful in 1 or 2 months, you're doing something wrong. I can't say that for hard tech, because like maybe there's like regulation around what you're doing, and it's probably not easy to build like a nuclear reactor in 2 months. It is somewhat more difficult to just like launch fast, probably, and I see that in some like health tech and fintech companies as well because of regulations and stuff like that. So that's one challenge. But at the same time, I think it's good to work on things that are really difficult or not sexy, because that means that you have market opportunities. Like not every like 20-year-old with a hoodie is not going to compete with you. And it basically, what do you know that a lot of people don't understand is like an important insight to have, right? Because I think while building a startup, you want to be contrarian and right? So being just right means that like something that everybody else knows, and there's going to be like a million other people that's doing what you do, so there's no way you're going to be successful. Being contrarian wrong means just you're just wrong or crazy, right? Being contrarian right leads to usually successful outcomes, and it's probably easier to be contrarian and right building a hard tech startup than building a photo sharing app.
All right, let's give Selcuk another hand here.
Cool. Well, thanks, guys. It was fun. Great questions.
With that, I hope everybody has a good week. Thanks, everyone.